year was 1943, and Britain was still reeling from years of brutal war. Night after night, sirens wailed over London as German bombers dropped destruction from the sky. But inside a quiet laboratory far from the front lines, a middle-aged engineer named Barnes Vollis was chasing an idea that most of his peers thought impossibly, an idea that would soon send a group of young men on one of the most daring missions in British history. Vollis was not a soldier. He was a thinker, a designer, and a dreamer who saw patterns where others saw problems. For months, he had obsessed over a question that had no simple answer. How do you destroy a dam that no bomb can touch? The great German dams, the MHT, Eder and Sorp, fed the factories of the Ruhr Valley, the beating heart of Nazi industry. Every bomb Britain dropped so far had failed. The dams were built of thick concrete and steel, shielded by anti-aircraft guns and torpedo nets that stopped underwater attacks. They were untouchably, at least. They seemed so. Vollis had spent countless nights sketching on scraps of paper, testing small models in his backyard pond, much to the confusion of his neighbors. He had noticed how a stone, when thrown just right, skipped across water. What if, he thought, a bomb could do the same? If it bounced, it could skip over the torpedo nets and strike the dam wall directly before sinking and exploding underwater. The water itself would amplify the blast, cracking even the strongest concrete. It was an elegant idea, but also, too many, an absurd one. When Vollis presented his concept to officials in the Air Ministry, the reaction was less than enthusiastic. One general reportedly muttered that it was a child's trick dressed up as science. Another officer, rolling his eyes, asked whether Vollis planned to throw stones at Hitler next, but Vollis refused to be laughed off. He explained the math, the spin, the release height, the timing, all meticulously calculated. The bomb would need to be dropped at exactly 240 miles per hour from 60 feet above the water, spinning backward at 500 revolutions per minute. Any higher or slower, and the bomb would sink or veer off course. Even so, early tests were humiliating. The prototype's heavy metal spheres often sank too soon or shattered on impact. Wallace's team watched as one after another failed, exploding uselessly or missing their targets. Critics in the ministry mocked the project openly, but Vollis was relentless. He adjusted the design, changing the casing, the fins, the release mechanism. He tested again and again, sometimes sneaking to the test site at dawn so he could work without interference. He was a man possessed by his own belief. Finally, in early 1943, at a coastal test range in Reculver, Kent, something extraordinary happened. A full-scale prototype, released from a modified Lancaster bomber flying low over the sea, bounced perfectly across the waves once, twice, 3 times before striking a wooden markup of a dam. The explosion that followed sent a column of water and debris shooting into the air. When the spray settled, the dam was gone. The blast had torn it apart. Vollis stood there trembling. The impossible had just become real. News of the test reached Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, head of Bomber Command, who had initially dismissed the idea. Now he could no longer ignore it. A new squadron was to be formed in absolute secrecy. No 617. Squadron made up of elite aircrews handpicked from across the RAF, their task, trained for a mission that no one could speak of and few would survive. The leader chosen for this extraordinary job was Wing Commander Guy Gibson, a young but battle-hardened pilot with more than 170 operations to his name. Gibson was known for his discipline and icy composure, and he was told almost nothing at first, only that he would lead a special operation requiring impossible flying skills. When Gibson finally met Vollis and saw the strange, drum-shaped bomb, he didn't know whether to laugh or swear. "You're serious?" he asked, touching the massive steel cylinder that would soon hang beneath his Lancaster. "You actually want us to bounce this thing across water?" Vollis nodded earnestly, explaining the physics again in his gentle, precise way. Gibson wasn't fully convinced, but he respected conviction when he saw it. "All right then," he said quietly. "Let's see if your trick works in the real world." And so the secret training began. Over quiet reservoirs and remote lakes, crews of 617 Squadron practiced flying at deathly low altitudes, often skimming just above the treetops or barely clearing church steeples. The bombers had no radar altimeters accurate enough for 60 feet. So ingenious pilots rigged up 2 angled spotlights under the fuselage. When their beams met on the surface of the water, they knew they were flying at the right height. At night, with engines roaring and darkness pressing in from every side, these men risked everything just to master a single skill flying straight, level, and impossibly low. Vollis visited the base often, watching the crews with quiet admiration. He was an outsider in their world of noise and danger, but they treated him with affection, calling him Pop. They could tell that he cared, not only about the bomb, but about the men who would carry it. Sometimes, late in the evening, he would stand beside the runway and look out into the night sky, wondering whether his invention would save lives or destroy them. The burden was heavy, and as the operation neared, sleep came rarely. By early May, the men of 617 Squadron were ready. Their target was revealed at last: the great dams of the Ruhr. The mission would take place under the cover of darkness, across hundreds of miles of enemy territory, and the odds were grim. As the date approached, tension filled every corner of RAF Scampton. The crews checked and rechecked their planes, their bombs, their maps. Wallace walked among them, smiling faintly, but his heart was heavy. He knew what his calculations demanded of them, and he feared what those calculations might cost. The night of May 16, 1943, drew near, and the hum of engines began to fill the air. Wallace stood quietly on the tarmac, watching as the first of Gibson's Lancasters taxied into position. In a few hours, the world would know whether his strange bouncing bomb was genius or madness. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the evening of May 16, 1943, RAF Scampton fell into an uneasy hush. The men of 617 Squadron gathered in a dimly lit briefing room, the air thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Maps of Germany were spread across the wall, with red strings marking flight paths that cut deep into enemy territory. For the first time, the crews were told the truth. Their targets were the great MCN, Edda and Sorp dams, the lifelines of Germany's industrial heartland. The room fell silent. Even the most fearless pilots shifted uneasily in their seats. They all knew what that meant. Wing Commander Guy Gibson stood at the front, his expression calm but his voice steady with resolve. "These dams supply water and power to Germany's war machine," he said, pointing to the map. "If we destroy them, we'll cripple the Ruhr and cut their production by half. But we'll only have one chance, and we'll be flying lower than anyone has ever flown before in combat." His eyes swept the room. "Make no mistake, this will be dangerous. Many of us may not come back, but if we succeed, we'll make history tonight." Behind him, engineers rolled in a strange cylindrical object, dull gray and heavy as sign. This was Upkeep, the bouncing bonbons Wallace had spent months perfecting. The crews murmured, half in awe, half in disbelief. It looked nothing like a weapon. It looked like a barrel built by a madman. Wallace himself stood in the corner, pale and anxious, clutching his notes as if they could protect the men about to trust their lives to his mathematics. Gibson introduced him quietly, and the room broke into respectful applause. Wallace smiled faintly, but his hands trembled. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, praying he hadn't miscalculated the drop. By 9:28 p.m., the first aircraft, Gibson's Lancaster, down the runway, its Merlin engines screaming into the night. One by one, the others followed, lifting into the dark, moonlit sky. 19 aircraft in all, each carrying a single bouncing bomb. On the ground, Wallace watched from the control tower, his heart in his throat. The hangars vibrated as the last Lancaster disappeared into the horizon, its red taillight shrinking until it was gone. For a moment, silence hung over Scampton, then the base returned to its uneasy rhythm, waiting for news that might never come. High above the North Sea, the bombers flew in tight formation, skimming barely a few hundred feet above the waves. The cold air rattled their cockpits, and every man inside knew how easy it would be to die out here. Radar could pick them up if they climbed too high. The sea could swallow them whole if they dipped too low. Some planes clipped the water's surface, spraying foam into the night. Others struggled to stay level as crosswinds buffeted their wings. It wasn't flying, it was survival by instinct and nerve. Over the Dutch coast, searchlights suddenly pierced the darkness, and German flak guns opened fire. Orange bursts exploded in the sky, sending shrapnel whistling past the aircraft. One Lancaster took a direct hit to the wing and vanished into a ball of fire, plunging into the fields below. The others pressed on, engines screaming, their pilots gripping the controls so tightly their knuckles turned white. Gibson's calm voice came over the radio. "Steady, lads. Keep her low, stay on course." As the squadron crossed into Germany, the moon glimmered on the rivers below, dark veins running through a sleeping nation that had no idea what was coming. Villagers on the ground looked up in confusion, hearing the roar of engines racing impossibly low. Some thought it was an accident, others ran for cover. The Lancasters tore through valleys and forests, weaving between hills and power lines, their bellies nearly scraping the treetops. Every crewman was alert, scanning for church spires, bridges, or sudden rises in terrain that could rip them apart in an instant. Inside Gibson's aircraft, the atmosphere was electric. The navigator called out bearings. The bomb aimer crouched at his post, scanning the black water ahead. At one point, the wireless operator reported heavy fire from a nearby town. Gibson's response was quiet but absolute. "Ignore it." Eyes on the dam, his crew obeyed. They were closing in on the Emshien Reservoir, their first target far away at Scampton. Barnes Wallace sat alone in the mess hall, untouched, tea growing cold beside him. Every time he tried to read or write, his mind replayed the same thought. What if I've killed them all? He had fought so hard to prove his invention worked, to convince men like Gibson that it was worth the risk. But now, as 19 aircraft streaked through the night toward one of the most heavily defended areas in Europe, all he felt was guilt. He had given them a weapon but not safety. Meanwhile, over Germany, the first loss reports began to come through. A plane had hit power lines and crashed in flames. Another was missing over the Zugnisee. Gibson knew his formation was thinning, but there was no turning back. Ahead, the faint outline of the Mchen Dam began to appear, silver under the moonlight. The water below was calm, reflecting the stars like a mirror. It was beautiful and deadly as Gibson and his crew prepared for the bombing run. The dam's defenses lit up, searchlights crisscrossed the sky, and flak erupted in bright flashes all around. The roar of anti-aircraft guns echoed off the valley walls. Still, Gibson held the Lancaster steady. "Steady, boys," he murmured. "This is it." Back in England, the minutes dragged by. Wallace couldn't stand still. He paced the hall, listening for the sound of telephones or footsteps, anything that might bring word from Germany. Somewhere out there, his invention was being put to the ultimate test. Somewhere young men were gambling their lives on his idea. And high over the Ruhr Valley, Gibson was about to drop the first of Barnes Wallace's stupid bouncing bombs. The Mchen loomed ahead like a sleeping giant, its vast curved wall shimmering under the moonlight. The roar of the Lancaster's engines filled the cockpit, but inside, the crew spoke in calm, clipped words, every man locked into his role. Gibson's eyes flicked between the instruments and the dark water below. 60 feet, called the flight engineer, his voice taut. The two angled spotlights under the fuselage met perfectly on the surface of the lake, a ghostly X that told them they were at the right height. Below them, the German gunners had already seen the approaching aircraft. Searchlights crisscrossed the sky in frantic sweeps. Then the first flak burst exploded nearby, shaking the bomber violently. Shards of hot metal clattered against the fuselage like hail. Gibson gritted his teeth and kept the Lancaster level. "Hold her steady," he said evenly. "Get ready." In the bomb bay, the upkeep spun furiously, its steel skin glinting in the moonlight. It had to be released at the perfect moment, too early and it would bounce short. Too late and it would crash into the dam. The bomb aimer crouched low, watching the distance markers flash by, counting in his head. His thumb hovered over the release switch. Bomb away. The Lancaster jolted upward as the massive cylinder dropped free. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the bomb hit the surface once, twice, 3 times, skipping across the water like a stone. Exactly as Barnes Wallace had imagined months before in his garden pond. It struck the dam's face, sank, and a moment later, a column of white water shot skyward. The explosion echoed across the valley. When the spray cleared, the dam still stood. The wall was cracked but unbroken. "No breach," the rear gunner reported. Gibson swore softly, banking the Lancaster away through a storm of tracer fire. "Right, next one in," he ordered over the radio. The second bomber, flown by Flight Lieutenant Mick Martin, came in even lower. His aircraft was hit several times, sparks spraying from the wings, but he pressed on, releasing his bomb perfectly. Again, the explosion threw water hundreds of feet into the air, shaking the dam, but still it held. It was as if the structure refused to die. Back in the control tower at Scampton, Barnes Wallace listened to the faint radio chatter coming through. He could barely make out the words, crackling, static, half-phrases noise. His heart pounded as he tried to follow what was happening, but no clear report came. He turned to the operations officer beside him, whispering, "Do you think they've made it?" The officer didn't answer. They both knew that silence could mean success or death. Meanwhile, over the Ruhr Valley, Gibson refused to give up. He circled back, flying low over the reservoir to draw enemy fire away from the others. The gunners on the dam now concentrated, their fire on him, their shells bursting in blinding flashes. His aircraft shuddered with every near miss. "Keep her level," he shouted, his voice hoarse. Then the third bomber came in flight, Lieutenant Dingy Young leading his crew through a wall of fire. "Steady, steady," his bomb aimer whispered. The Lancaster roared over the water, flak bursting all around. The bomb dropped cleanly, bounced perfectly, and struck the dam dead center. This time, when it exploded, the entire valley seemed to tremble. Gibson banked hard to one side, turning back to look. A low rumble rolled through the air, a deep guttural sound like thunder from the earth itself. A huge crack split the middle of the dam, water beginning to gush through in silver streams that widened by the second. Then, with a sound like mountains breaking, the Mchen Dam gave way. Millions of tons of water surged through the breach, cascading into the valley below. Villages, bridges, and factories were instantly swept away. The destruction was immense. Inside the Lancaster, the crew cheered, disbelief and relief crashing together. "She's gone. The dam's gone," one of them shouted. Gibson, exhausted but steady, spoke into the radio. "Target destroyed. The Mchen is breached." His message was simple, but the weight of it was immense. At RAF Scampton, the message arrived minutes later. When the operations officer repeated it aloud, Barnes Wallace sank into a chair, his face pale. "Breached," he whispered as though testing the word. He had done it. His strange spinning bomb had worked exactly as he dreamed. And yet, instead of elation, he felt something else, a heavy sorrow creeping over him. He thought of the men out there, the noise, the terror, the ones who would never come home. But the mission wasn't over. 2 more dams remained, Edda and Sorp. Gibson gathered the surviving aircraft and led them on, pushing deeper into Germany. Below them, the flood from the Mchen tore through the valley, smashing everything in its path. Thousands of German civilians, including forced laborers from occupied countries, were caught in the torrent. In war, victory always came with a price. As Gibson's formation approached the Eder Dam, they found it surrounded by steep hills and mist that made approach nearly impossible. They circled again and again, trying to find the right angle. Each pass was a dance with death. One wrong move, and the bomber would crash into the valley walls. The crews were exhausted, their nerves frayed, but they refused to quit. They had come too far at last. One aircraft flown by Flight Lieutenant Les Knight made a perfect approach. His bomb struck true, detonating deep against the wall. The explosion was even greater than before. The eater shuddered, cracked, and finally burst open, releasing another massive wave of destruction. In the cockpit of Gibson's plane, the men stared in stunned silence. 2 dams gone. Against all odds, Wallace's impossible weapon had done exactly what it was meant to do. Far away in Lincolnshire, Barnes Wallace stood alone under the stars outside the control tower. He looked toward the east, where the night sky glowed faintly red from distant fires. His invention had worked, but he couldn't shake the thought of the men flying through that firestorm to make it happen. "God, bring them home," he whispered. By the time the Eder Dam burst was well past midnight on May 17, 1943. The valley below was consumed by a monstrous wave of water that roared through the dark, carrying with it trees, bridges, homes, and people. Entire villages were wiped from the map in minutes. To the crews of 617 Squadron, it was a breathtaking sight, the proof that their mission had worked. But behind the adrenaline and relief, there was also an eerie silence, the heavy awareness of what that success meant. Thousands were dying below, swept away by the very flood they had unleashed. Guy Gibson didn't have time to think about that. His focus was on survival and on the last target, the Sorp Dam. Unlike the others, Sorp was made of earth and concrete, an immense structure that wouldn't yield to a single explosion. It would have to be attacked in a different way. Bombs dropped along the crest, one after another like hammer blows. Only one Lancaster from the first wave, flown by Flight Lieutenant Joe McCarthy, was still in condition to make the attempt. McCarthy's approach was fraught with danger. The dam sat in misty highlands surrounded by steep terrain. He had to dive into the valley, level out just above the water, and release his bomb at the perfect angle, all while under threat of gunfire. Gibson, orbiting nearby in his own aircraft, guided him in over the radio. "Take your time, Mac, no rush, get it right." On the first run, McCarthy's aircraft was too high. The second was too low, the bomb aimer yelling corrections as flak lit the night. "One more," McCarthy shouted. "We'll make it this time." The third run was flawless. The bomb struck cleanly, detonating against the top of the dam. A massive plume of water erupted, but when the mist cleared, Sorp still stood. The explosion had damaged it badly, but not enough to breach it completely. McCarthy turned for home, exhausted and half-deafened, his aircraft riddled with holes. Gibson, realizing the remaining planes were running low on fuel and ammunition, made the call. "That's it, lads. We're done. Head for home." His voice was calm, but there was something weary in it, now a quiet understanding that the night had taken a terrible toll. Back in England, Barnes Wallace waited in agony. The first coded messages from Germany were vague, garbled by static. He sat hunched over a radio in the operations room, straining to make out the words breached Eder, breached Sorp, damaged. For a moment he couldn't speak. The officers around him exchanged looks, some triumphant, others solemn. The mission had succeeded beyond expectation, but Wallace's mind was elsewhere. "How many came back?" he asked quietly. No one answered. Hours later, as dawn broke over RAF Scampton, the first bombers began to return. One by one, battered Lancasters limped back across the runway, engines coughing, fuselages torn and blackened by flak. Ground crews ran to meet them, cheering as they climbed out, filthy, exhausted, but alive. Gibson stood by his plane, his face pale, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. He didn't smile when they called him a hero. He just nodded, silently counting the aircraft that didn't return. Of the 19 Lancasters that had taken off, only 11 came back. 8 aircraft had been lost, and 53 men were dead or missing. Many were barely 20 years old. Gibson stood on the tarmac as the final plane landed, then looked toward the horizon, where the sun was rising over the Lincolnshire fields. "That's all of them," someone said softly. He didn't reply when Barnes Wallace arrived on base that morning. The atmosphere was surreal, half celebration, half mourning. The hangars echoed with laughter and silence in equal measure. He went straight to the operations office, asking again and again for the casualty list. When he finally saw it, he covered his face with his hands. "I didn't mean them to die," he whispered. "I just wanted to end the war sooner." That same morning, British radio broadcasted news of the raid. Last night, a specially trained squadron of the Royal Air Force carried out an attack of exceptional daring upon the great dams of the Roar Valley. The announcer declared proudly. Across Britain, the story spread like wildfire: the miracle of the bouncing bomb, the courage of the Dambusters, the genius of the engineer who made it possible. But at Scampton, amid the wrecked planes and missing faces, glory felt like a hollow word. Guy Gibson was summoned to London within days. There, in the marble corridors of Whitehall, He was greeted by applause and awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor for bravery. Photographers flashed their bulbs, and ministers shook his hand. Magnificent work, they told him. But when Gibson looked into the lenses, his expression remained distant. He had done his duty, but the cost was written on his face. For Barnes-Wallis, the aftermath was harder still. He was hailed as a national hero, his invention praised as a triumph of British ingenuity. But the adulation sat uneasily with him. He couldn't stop thinking of the young men who had died flying his creation, or of the German civilians drowned in the floods. Late one night, a fellow officer found him alone in his office, staring at blueprints of the bomb. "You changed the course of the war," the officer said. Wallis shook his head. "I changed the course of too many lives," he replied quietly still. Even through his guilt, he knew the raid had mattered. The destruction of the Ruhr dams had dealt a severe blow to German industry, halting steel and munitions production for weeks. It had forced Hitler to divert thousands of workers and troops to rebuild the dam's resources that could have been used elsewhere. And, perhaps most importantly, it had given Britain a desperately needed morale boost at a dark moment in the war. Yet for the men who had flown that night, the raid would never feel like triumph. It was a memory etched in noise and fire, in the sight of friends disappearing into darkness. It was something too raw for medals to erase. As dawn brightened over the airfield, the surviving crews gathered for a final debriefing. The room was filled with the smell of oil, sweat, and exhaustion. Gibson stood before them, his voice low but steady. "You've done something the world will never forget," he said. "You've done your duty." There was no cheering, no applause, just silence, heavy and proud. Outside, Barnes-Wallis watched the sun rise over the airfield, lighting the battered Lancasters that had limped home. He thought of the young faces he had seen days earlier, joking and laughing during training. Now, half of them were gone. And yet, despite the pain in his heart, he knew that what they had achieved would echo through history. In the days following the raid, Britain was electrified. Newspapers blazed with headlines about the Dambusters, a name that would soon enter legend. Photos of Guy Gibson and his men appeared everywhere, their faces young and proud, standing before their battered Lancasters. The public saw heroes. They saw courage, precision, and victory. The truth, however, was quieter and heavier, an ache that hung in the air at RAF Scampton, where empty bunks and silent mess tables spoke more honestly than any headline could. For Barnes-Wallis, the sudden fame felt unbearable. Ministers called him a genius. Newspapers demanded interviews. He was summoned to London, where senior officials congratulated him and even hinted that his bomb might end the war sooner. But behind the praise, Wallis couldn't escape the faces of the men who hadn't come home. When someone asked him how he felt, he simply said, "Tired." He wasn't built for glory. He was built for work, for thought, for quiet creation, not for the weight of lives lost because of his ideas. Still, the impact of his invention was undeniable. Reconnaissance photos showed the devastation in the Ruhr Valley, power stations drowned, roads torn apart, railway lines twisted into nothing. German engineers estimated that production in the region had dropped by nearly half. 4 weeks, factories stood silent as tens of thousands of workers were redirected to repair the damage. Even Hitler was shaken. He called the attack catastrophic and personally ordered the dams to be rebuilt at all costs. Yet for all the strategic damage, the human cost on the ground was immense. The Mchen flood swept through towns and villages, killing over 1,600 people, including hundreds of foreign laborers forced to work under Nazi control. The British government never mentioned that part in public, but Wallis knew. When he was told of the civilian deaths, he sat in silence for a long time, then said quietly, "That is not what I wanted." His wife later recalled finding him in his study that night, staring at the blueprints of the bomb, tears in his eyes. Meanwhile, 617 Squadron was both celebrated and haunted. They were suddenly famous, invited to banquets, interviewed by the press, toasted in Parliament, but fame sat awkwardly on men who had spent the last week flying at 60 feet over death. They had seen too much. During one interview, a journalist asked a gunner what it felt like to destroy a dam. The man stared at him for a long time before answering. It felt like surviving. Guy Gibson, now a national hero, was the most conflicted of all. At first he carried himself with military composure, shaking hands, accepting medals, smiling for cameras. He even attended a meeting with King George VI, who congratulated him personally. But those close to him noticed the change. He drank more, he spoke less. When people praised him for his bravery, he looked away. "We just did what we had to do," he'd say quietly. The real heroes didn't come back. At Scampton, Gibson made sure that every man who died on the raid was remembered. He personally wrote to the families of each one, describing their courage and their final moments. The letters were full of warmth and respect, but carried a deep sadness between the lines. In one, he wrote, "They did not die for glory. They died so that others might live in freedom." Wallis, meanwhile, buried himself in work. He was already thinking of new designs, better, safer weapons that could end the war faster. But inside, something had shifted. He no longer spoke with the same excited energy that once drove him. The war had taught him that invention, no matter how clever, always came at a price. His own creation had proven that brilliantly and terribly. In Germany, the reaction was chaotic. The floodwaters had caused massive destruction, but the propaganda ministry spun it quickly, insisting that morale was unbroken. In secret, though, Nazi engineers studied fragments of the bomb recovered from the wreckage, marveling at its precision. Even the German press admitted, in a rare moment of respect, that it was a feat of engineering genius. For the men of 617 Squadron, life slowly settled into routine again, but it was never the same. The squadron was kept together, its reputation as an elite force cemented. They were soon sent on even more dangerous missions, this time using Wallace's new Tallboy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs to destroy viaducts, battleships, and U-boat pens. The Dambusters had become the spearhead of precision bombing, and their legend continued to grow. But for many of them, the night of May 16th to 17th never faded. It haunted their dreams, the flashing flag, the bouncing bomb spinning beneath the fuselage, the roar of the explosion, and the sight of a dam breaking apart under the moonlight. Some described it as the most terrifying night of their lives, others as the proudest. Perhaps it was both. And for Barnes Volus, even years later, it remained personal. He often visited the graves of the fallen airmen, quietly laying flowers without speaking a word. He once told a colleague, "Every time I think of the Dambusters, I don't see dams, I see faces." Yet in that mix of pride, guilt, and grief lay something timeless, the spirit that had driven ordinary men to attempt the impossible. Guided by an engineer who believed that science could win a war. In the years that followed, the story of the Dambusters became legend, told and retold in newspapers, documentaries, and films. Children learned their names in school, historians debated their impact, and the public celebrated the raid as a turning point in the war. But for those who had lived it, the truth remained much more complex. It was a story of courage, yes, but also of guilt, loss, and a quiet, lasting pain that never entirely faded. Barnes Volus never truly recovered from the emotional toll of the mission. After the war ended, he continued working for the Royal Aircraft Establishment, designing revolutionary aircraft and weapons. But whenever people tried to praise him for the bouncing bomb, his response was almost always the same. "Don't thank me for that." He once told a reporter, "I feel like I sent those boys to their deaths." His colleagues admired his brilliance but pitied his sorrow. For Volus, genius had come at the cost of peace of mind on public, though. He remained a symbol of British ingenuity, the quiet inventor who had helped shorten the war. When the 1955 film The Dambusters was released, he was portrayed as a calm, heroic figure, deeply committed to his work. Volus watched the film privately with his wife. She said that afterward, he sat silently for a long time, then murmured, "They made it look so clean." It wasn't clean at all. To him, the raid was never about cinematic heroics. It was about the real men who risked everything to make it impossible. Idea work. Guy Gibson's story was equally tragic. After the Dambusters raid, he became a national icon, touring America, giving speeches, and even writing a memoir titled Enemy Coast Ahead. But fame weighed heavily on him. The war had left him restless, unable to escape the ghosts of those he had led into battle. In 1944, while flying a Mosquito on a mission over the Netherlands, Gibson's aircraft crashed, killing him instantly. He was 26 years old. To this day, no one knows exactly why the plane went down. Some say fuel exhaustion, others say enemy fire. Whatever the cause, Britain lost one of its finest pilots, and Barnes Volus lost another piece of his heart. When news of Gibson's death reached Volus, he reportedly broke down and wept. "He was the bravest man I ever knew," he said simply. For Volus, the raid had begun as an idea, a calculation, but it ended as a collection of names, faces, and memories carved forever into his conscience. As the decades passed, the Dambusters raid was studied and analyzed endlessly. Strategists debated its true value. Some argued it didn't change the overall course of the war as much as the legend suggested. Others claimed it crippled German morale and forced massive industrial diversion. But numbers and maps could never capture the human side of what had happened, the audacity of flying at 60 feet in darkness, the faith placed in a strange new weapon, and the heartbreak that followed success. In post-war Germany, the story was remembered differently. Survivors of the flooding spoke of horror, of loss, of children and families swept away in the torrent. For them, the raid was not a tale of courage but of tragedy. And yet, over time, even many of them came to see it not as an act of cruelty but as a desperate measure in a desperate war. The survivors and the veterans would later meet at memorials, shaking hands, exchanging stories, and acknowledging the shared suffering that war demands from everyone it touches. Volus lived long enough to see that reconciliation. In 1967, he attended a memorial service for the Dambusters, surrounded by aging veterans who had once been young men under Guy Gibson's command. They spoke softly, remembering the ones who didn't make it home. Volus stood apart for a moment, gazing at the wreaths laid for the fallen, then whispered, "They did something wonderful and terrible." He remained devoted to engineering all his life, turning his genius toward peaceful applications: aircraft design, supersonic flight, and humanitarian technology. When he was knighted in 1968, he accepted the honor with humility, but later told a friend, "All I ever wanted was to make something useful." When Sir Barnes Wallis died in 1979, aged 92, the RAF flew a Lancaster bomber over his funeral as a final salute. Its engines droned low over the churchyard, an echo of that night in 1943 when his idea took flight. Old Dambusters, their hair grey and their eyes misted with memory, stood silently as the aircraft passed overhead. To them, he was not just the man who built a bomb. He was the man who had dared to imagine what others thought impossible, and who had carried the weight of that imagination for the rest of his life. Today, the story of the Dambusters endures not merely as a tale of wartime triumph, but as a reflection of humanity's contradictions, bravery and fear, invention and destruction, pride and regret. The raid proved what human courage and ingenuity could achieve, but it also reminded the world what such achievements cost. In that haunting balance between brilliance and burden lies the truth behind the legend of the stupid bouncing bomb trick that smashed German dams and changed the course of history, not through fantasy, but through flesh, blood, and the fragile, unforgettable courage of real men.